What happens when a powerful CEO running from scandal gets trapped by a snowstorm with the one man who holds the key to her destruction? Margaret Lawson built an empire on secrets and silence. Thomas Reed lost everything because of those same secrets. Now, as a Vermont blizzard rages outside, they're trapped together in a remote mountain estate. She doesn't know who he is. He knows exactly who she is. And his 16-year-old daughters is about to change both their lives forever. This is a story about truth redemption and the courage to face the consequences of our choices. If you enjoy powerful emotional storytelling, please like this video and subscribe for more life-changing tales. Now let's begin. Mom would want the truth, not your silence. CEO trapped with man who could destroy her. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the Vermont snow. Margaret Lawson gripped the steering wheel of her black SUV, squinting through the white curtain that had descended over the mountain road. The GPS signal had died 20 minutes ago, leaving her alone with the storm and her racing thoughts. She shouldn't have come here, shouldn't have run. But when her assistant called that morning with news that the federal investigation was accelerating, something inside her had snapped. 25 years of building Lawson infrastructure from nothing, and it could all crumble within weeks. The SUV's wheels spun uselessly as she tried to navigate a sharp turn. The vehicle slid sideways, coming to rest against a snowbank with a dull thud. Margaret sat in the sudden silence, her breath forming clouds in the rapidly cooling air. The engine sputtered once, then died. "Perfect," she whispered. Outside, the wind howled through towering pine trees, their branches heavy with snow. She pulled out her phone, but still, no signal. The temperature was dropping fast, and she could already feel the cold seeping through the metal frame of the car. A beam of light cut through the snowfall. Margaret's heart jumped as she saw a figure approaching, a tall man in a heavy coat carrying a flashlight. He moved with purpose through the storm, his boots crunching in the deep snow. He tapped on her window. Margaret hesitated, then lowered it a few inches. "Engine trouble." His voice was deep calm despite the storm raging around them. "It won't start," she called over the wind. "My GPS died. I'm lost." "You can't stay out here. Temperature's dropping to -20 tonight." He stepped back as she opened the door. "I'm Thomas Reed. I live about a quarter mile up the road. You can wait out the storm there." Margaret studied his face in the flashlight's glow. Mid-50s, weathered skin, kind eyes. He looked familiar somehow, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. "Margaret Lawson," she said, grabbing her overnight bag from the back seat. "I appreciate this." They trudged through knee-deep snow toward a faint glow in the distance. The estate that emerged from the storm was nothing like she'd expected, a sprawling log and stone structure that spoke of old money and careful craftsmanship. Warm light spilled from large windows, promising refuge from the bitter cold. "Built it myself, mostly," Thomas said as they climbed the front steps. "Took 7 years." The interior was even more impressive. Exposed wooden beams stretched across vaulted ceilings, and a massive stone fireplace dominated the main living area. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere of rustic elegance. "Dad," a teenage girl appeared at the top of a wooden staircase. She was perhaps 16, with her father's dark hair and intelligent eyes. "Who's our guest?" "This is Margaret. Her car broke down in the storm." And Thomas helped Margaret out of her coat. "Margaret, my daughter Emily." Emily descended the stairs with the easy grace of youth. "Are you okay? That storm came out of nowhere." "I'm fine, thanks to your father." Margaret felt an unexpected warmth at the girl's genuine concern. She couldn't remember the last time a teenager had shown such natural kindness to a stranger. "Emily, could you make some coffee? Margaret looks like she could use something warm." "Already on it," Emily said with a smile. "I'll grab you some dry socks too. Dad's got extras." As Emily disappeared into what Margaret assumed was the kitchen, Thomas gestured toward the fire. "Please sit. I'll call about getting your car towed, but I doubt anyone's moving it until this blows over." Margaret settled into a leather armchair facing the flames. The warmth felt incredible after the bitter cold outside. She watched Thomas move around the room with quiet efficiency, adding logs to the fire, adjusting a heavy curtain to block a draft. Everything about him suggested competence and care. "Beautiful place," she said. "You said you built it yourself." "Most of it. Used to be in construction. Civil engineering, actually." He paused, poker in hand. specialized in bridges and infrastructure projects. Something cold moved through Margaret's chest. Civil engineering. Infrastructure. That explained the familiarity she'd felt when she first saw him. Her company had worked with hundreds of engineers over the years. What kind of infrastructure work? She kept her voice casual, but her hands tightened on the armrests. Mostly bridge construction and renovation. Worked on some major projects before. He trailed off, setting the poker aside. Before I decided the mountain life suited me better. Emily returned with coffee and thick wool socks. Dad gave up the big city life after Mom died, she said matter-of-factly. Said he wanted somewhere quiet to raise me. I'm sorry for your loss, Margaret said, accepting the steaming mug. The coffee was perfect strong, but not bitter. Thank you, it was a long time ago. Thomas settled into the chair across from her. Emily was just 6. The bridge collapsed in Hartford, Emily added quietly. Mom was driving to pick me up from school when it happened. Margaret's coffee cup slipped in her hands. She caught it before it fell, but hot liquid splashed onto her fingers. Hartford, the Memorial Bridge collapse. 7 years ago this month, Thomas said. His voice had gone flat, emotionless. 23 people died that day. The fire crackled in the sudden silence. Margaret stared into the flames, her mind racing. The Hartford Memorial Bridge, one of the most devastating infrastructure failures in Connecticut's history. Her company had been the primary contractor for the renovation work completed just months before the collapse. She remembered the congressional hearings, the lawsuits, the media frenzy. Lawson Infrastructure had ultimately been cleared of wrongdoing, structural fatigue, they'd concluded. An act of God that no amount of engineering could have prevented. But she also remembered the whispers. An engineer who'd raised concerns about stress fractures. Someone who'd been silenced, discredited. Someone whose warnings had been buried in a mountain of paperwork and corporate liability concerns. I should check the weather report, Thomas said, standing abruptly. See how long this storm is supposed to last. Margaret watched him leave the room, her heart pounding. She pulled out her phone, grateful to see a single bar of signal. With trembling fingers, she navigated to her secure work files and pulled up the Hartford Bridge investigation documents. There it was, buried in the footnotes of a subcommittee report. Thomas Reed, licensed civil engineer, Riverside Construction Consulting. The engineer who'd submitted a formal safety concern 6 weeks before the collapse. The concern that had been deemed unsubstantiated by the review board. The concern that Margaret herself had ordered buried. The Weather Service says it should clear by morning, Thomas said as he returned to the living room. But the roads won't be passable until the plows come through. That could be noon or later. Margaret looked up from her phone, studying his face in the firelight. Did he know who she was? Had he recognized her name when she introduced herself? I hope I'm not imposing too much, she managed to say. Not at all. Emily and I don't get many visitors, especially in winter. It's nice to have company. Emily curled up on the sofa with a thick book. Dad, remember when we got snowed in for 5 days last year? We played so many board games I thought my brain would melt. I remember you winning every single game of Monopoly, Thomas said with a fond smile. I'm very competitive, Emily said proudly. Mom always said I got that from Dad. Your mother sounds like she was a wonderful woman, Margaret said carefully. Emily's expression grew thoughtful. She was amazing. A kindergarten teacher. She loved kids so much, always brought home stories about her students. She paused, looking at her father. I think that's why Dad works so hard to make sure other kids have safe places to learn and play. What do you mean? Margaret asked. Oh, Dad still does consulting work sometimes. Safety inspections for schools and public buildings. Pro bono stuff mostly. Emily's voice carried obvious pride. He says someone has to speak up for the people who can't protect themselves. Thomas cleared his throat. Emily, it's getting late. Don't you have that history paper to finish? Right, the Revolutionary War essay. Emily stood and kissed her father's cheek. Nice meeting you, Margaret. I hope the storm clears soon so you can get where you're going. Thank you, dear. Sleep well. After Emily disappeared upstairs, an uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Margaret stared into the fire, acutely aware of Thomas's presence across from her. The weight of recognition sat heavy in her chest. Margaret, Thomas said quietly, can I ask what brought you up here in the middle of winter? Seems like an odd time for a vacation. She looked at him, then really looked. He was watching her with those calm, intelligent eyes. There was no accusation in his expression, but there was something else. Knowledge, maybe, or suspicion. Business, she said finally. I needed to get away from the city for a while. What kind of business are you in? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Margaret felt her throat go dry. Construction, infrastructure, development. Thomas nodded slowly. Big projects. Some bridges mostly, public works. Must be rewarding work, building things that last, that keep people safe. There was something in his tone, not quite sarcasm, but close. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. It can be challenging, she said carefully. Imagine it would be. Heavy responsibility, making sure everything is built to code, making sure the engineer's recommendations are followed. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. He knew. Somehow he knew exactly who she was and what she'd done. Thomas, she began, but he held up a hand. It's late, he said, standing. I'll show you to the guest room. We can talk more in the morning. He led her upstairs to a comfortable room overlooking the snow-covered forest. The bed was made with thick quilts and a small electric heater hummed quietly in the corner. Extra blankets in the closet if you need them, Thomas said from the doorway. Bathrooms across the hall. Thank you for everything. He paused his hand on the doorframe. Margaret, yes. Sleep well. But Margaret knew she wouldn't sleep at all. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the swirling snow. Somewhere in this house was the man whose life she'd destroyed 7 years ago. The man who'd tried to save lives, including his wife's, and been silenced for his efforts. The man who could destroy her with a single phone call. She pulled out her phone again and scrolled through the Hartford files until she found what she was looking for. Thomas Reed's original safety report, marked confidential, do not distribute. She read it again, her stomach twisting with each technical detail. He'd been right about everything. Every stress point that had failed, every weakness that had led to the collapse, he'd identified it all 6 weeks before the bridge fell. And Margaret's company had buried his report, threatened his consulting and business, and discredited his expertise to protect their liability. 23 people had died because of that decision, including Thomas's wife. Margaret closed the file and set the phone aside. Outside, the wind howled through the pine trees and snow continued to fall. She was trapped here until morning, trapped with the ghost of her worst decision and the man she'd wronged most deeply. For the first time in 25 years of building her empire, Margaret Lawson felt truly powerless. Down the hall, she could hear Thomas moving quietly in what was presumably his bedroom. The old house creaked and settled around her, and Emily's gentle breathing was just audible through the thin walls. A family, a life rebuilt after unimaginable loss. And tomorrow when the snow cleared and the roads reopened, Margaret would drive away and leave them to whatever peace they'd managed to find. But first she had to survive the night. Margaret woke to the sound of a snow plow rumbling past on the main road. Gray morning light filtered through the guest room window, illuminating a world transformed by the storm. The snow had stopped, but drifts reached nearly to the first-floor windows of Thomas's house. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, following the scent of coffee and bacon. In the kitchen, she found Emily at the stove, flipping pancakes with practiced ease. Thomas sat at a wooden table by the window, nursing a steaming mug and reading something on his phone. Good morning, Emily said cheerfully. I hope you slept okay. Dad says the roads should be clear by afternoon. I slept fine, thank you. Margaret accepted the offered cup of coffee, grateful for something to do with her hands. This smells wonderful. Emily's been cooking breakfast for us since she was 12, Thomas said without looking up from his phone. She's better at it than I am. Dad's cooking is legendary, Emily said with a grin. Legendarily bad. Despite everything, Margaret found herself smiling. There was something deeply comforting about their easy banter, the obvious love between father and daughter. It reminded her of something she'd never had, a real family built on trust and sacrifice rather than ambition and control. Any news about my car? Margaret asked, settling into the chair across from Thomas. Bill's garage is sending someone out around 10. Engine probably just froze up in the cold. Thomas finally looked at her, and Margaret felt that same uncomfortable recognition in his eyes. Shouldn't take long to fix. Emily set a plate of pancakes in front of Margaret, then joined them at the table with her own breakfast. So what do you do in the city? Margaret? Margaret's fork hesitated halfway to her mouth. I'm a CEO, construction and infrastructure. Like Dad used to do, similar. Maybe you two work together sometime, Emily said innocently. Dad did projects all over New England before we moved here. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret could feel Thomas watching her, waiting to see how she'd respond to his daughter's innocent observation. It's a small industry, Margaret said carefully. We might have crossed paths. Dad, didn't you work on that big bridge project in Hartford before Mom died? The one that— Emily stopped abruptly, her face flushing. Sorry, I shouldn't have brought that up. It's okay, sweetheart, Thomas said gently. Yes, I worked on the Hartford Memorial Bridge renovation. It was my last big project before we moved here. Margaret set down her fork, her appetite gone. That must have been difficult, working on something so close to home. It was important work, Thomas said. His voice carried a weight that made Margaret's chest tight. Public safety always is. Dad tried so hard to make sure that bridge was safe, Emily said quietly. He worked nights and weekends, checking and double-checking everything. Mom used to joke that he loved that bridge more than he loved her. Thomas reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand. Your mother knew better than that. You were very thorough, Margaret said. She meant it to sound casual, but her voice came out strained. I tried to be. When you're responsible for people's lives, you can't take shortcuts. Thomas's eyes met Margaret's across the table. You have to speak up when something's wrong, even if it's inconvenient for other people. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. The message was unmistakable. What happened? She asked, though she already knew the answer. With the bridge, I mean. Emily's face fell. It collapsed 6 months after the renovation was finished. Mom was driving home from work. She trailed off, unable to finish. 23 people died, Thomas said quietly, including the woman I loved more than life itself. The simple words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She pushed her chair back from the table, suddenly desperate for air. Excuse me, I need to— Margaret. Thomas's voice stopped her at the kitchen doorway. Could I speak with you privately? Emily looked between them, sensing the tension she didn't understand. I'll clean up here, she said diplomatically. Thomas led Margaret into a small study lined with engineering textbooks and framed photos of Emily at various ages. He closed the door behind them and turned to face her. How long have you known? Margaret asked before he could speak. Since last night. I looked you up after Emily went to bed. Thomas moved to his desk and picked up a printed article. Margaret Lawson, CEO of Lawson Infrastructure. The woman who buried my safety report and let 23 people die. Margaret sank into a leather chair, her legs suddenly weak. I didn't know your wife was— Does it matter? Would it change anything if she'd been a stranger? Thomas's voice remained calm, but Margaret could see the pain in his eyes. You had my report 6 weeks before the collapse. 6 weeks to reinforce those stress points. 6 weeks to save lives. We had engineering consultants review your findings. They determined it would cost $3 million to fix and another 6 months of construction delays. Thomas interrupted. So you buried it. You threatened my consulting business and blacklisted me from future projects to keep me quiet. Margaret closed her eyes. Every word he spoke was true. We honestly believed the bridge was safe. The consultants said what you paid them to say. And Thomas moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered forest. I spent months trying to get someone to listen. The state engineering board, the federal highway administration, local news stations. But Lawson Infrastructure had more lawyers and deeper pockets than one freelance engineer. I'm sorry, Margaret whispered. I'm so sorry about your wife, about all of it. Thomas turned back to her, his expression unreadable. Are you just sorry you got caught? The question hung in the air between them. Margaret wanted to tell him that she'd regretted the decision every day for 7 years, that the guilt had eaten away at her until she could barely function, that she'd thrown herself into building her company because work was the only thing that kept the memories at bay. But what was the point? It wouldn't bring back his wife. It wouldn't undo the damage she'd caused. What do you want? She asked finally. You could destroy me. One phone call to the media, and everything I've built would disappear overnight. The federal investigation would have exactly what they need to prosecute me. Thomas studied her for a long moment. Is that what you think this is about, revenge? Isn't it? He sat down across from her, his movements careful and deliberate. 7 years ago, I wanted revenge. I wanted to watch your company burn and see you in prison where you belonged. What changed? Thomas glanced toward the closed door beyond which they could hear Emily humming while she cleaned the kitchen. I realized that destroying you wouldn't bring Sarah back. It wouldn't undo Emily's grief or make the other victims' families whole. It would just create more pain. Margaret felt tears threaten for the first time in decades. So you just let it go. I chose peace over justice. I chose to build a life where Emily could heal and grow away from the anger and bitterness that was consuming me. But now I'm here, in your home. Yes, Thomas said quietly, now you're here. They sat in silence for several minutes. Outside, Margaret could hear the sound of another snowplow working its way up the mountain road. The federal investigation, Thomas said finally. How bad is it? Margaret looked at him in surprise. You know about that. I still have friends in the industry. Word gets around when the feds start sniffing around a major contractor. Bad, Margaret admitted. They're looking at irregularities in our safety reporting going back 15 years. If they find what they're looking for, you'll lose everything. Yes. Thomas leaned back in his chair. What did you do? The question was asked without judgment, just genuine curiosity. Margaret found herself answering before she could stop herself. Cut corners, ignored inconvenient engineering reports, paid off inspectors, all in the name of staying competitive and maintaining profit margins. She laughed bitterly. I told myself I was protecting jobs, keeping the company viable, but really I was just protecting my own power. Any more disasters like Hartford? No, thank God no, but there were close calls, structures that should have been condemned and rebuilt instead of renovated, bridges that passed inspection because the right palms were greased. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Why are you telling me this? Margaret looked at him, really looked at him. Here was a man who had every right to hate her, who could destroy her with a single phone call. And instead of demanding justice or threatening exposure, he was sitting quietly listening to her confession with something that looked almost like compassion. Because I'm tired, she said simply. Tired of the lies, tired of the guilt, tired of building my life on other people's graves. A knock on the study door interrupted them. Dad? Emily's voice was muffled but concerned. The tow truck's here. Thomas stood. We should go see about your car. Margaret followed him back to the kitchen where Emily was washing dishes at the sink. The teenager looked up when they entered, and her expression immediately brightened. Everything okay? She asked. Fine, sweetheart, Thomas said. Margaret and I were just discussing some business matters. But Emily was too perceptive to be fooled entirely. She looked between the two adults, noting Margaret's pale complexion and her father's careful composure. Business from a long time ago, she said. It wasn't a question. Thomas hesitated. Emily, it's about Mom, isn't it? Emily set down the dish she'd been washing and turned to face them fully. About the bridge. The silence stretched between them. Margaret felt a crushing sense of inevitability, as if the weight of 7 years of lies was finally too heavy to carry. Yes, Thomas said quietly. It's about the bridge. Emily looked at Margaret with those intelligent, dark eyes so much like her father's. You worked on it. Yes. For the company that ignored Dad's warnings. Margaret felt her throat close up. Yes. Emily nodded slowly, processing this information. Margaret waited for anger, for accusations, for the rage of a child whose mother had been stolen from her. Instead, Emily said, You must carry a lot of guilt. The unexpected kindness in the teenager's voice nearly broke Margaret completely. Tears she'd been holding back for hours finally spilled over. I'm sorry, Margaret whispered. I'm so sorry. Emily moved forward and in a gesture that stunned Margaret took her hand. I know you are. Emily, Thomas said softly, you don't have to. Dad. Emily looked at her father with a maturity beyond her 16 years. She's been carrying this pain just like we have. Maybe it's time we all started healing. Outside, a truck horn honked twice. Margaret wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. That's my cue, she said. I should go. Margaret, Thomas said as she reached for her coat. The federal investigation. When is it likely to come to a head? Soon, maybe days, maybe weeks. My lawyers are running out of stalling tactics. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. And if they find what they're looking for, prison, probably 20 years, maybe more. Emily looked at her father. Some silent communication passed between them, the kind of wordless understanding that develops between people who've weathered tragedy together. Dad, Emily said quietly, what would Mom want? Thomas's composure finally cracked. For just a moment, Margaret saw the grief he'd been carrying for 7 years, raw, devastating, eternal. Then he pulled himself together with visible effort. Your mother, he said, his voice rough with emotion, would want the truth. The garage mechanic had been right. It was just a frozen fuel line. Within an hour, Margaret's SUV was running smoothly again. She stood in Thomas's driveway, car keys in hand, knowing that once she drove away, everything would change. Thank you, she said to Thomas and Emily, who had come out to see her off, for everything. Drive carefully, Emily said. The roads might still be slippery. Margaret nodded, then hesitated. Thomas, I want you to know. I know, he said quietly. She got into her car and drove slowly down the mountain road, her mind churning with everything that had transpired. In her rear-view mirror, she could see Thomas and Emily standing in their doorway until the trees blocked them from view. The drive back to the city gave Margaret 3 hours to think. By the time she reached her Manhattan penthouse, she had made her decision. She called her legal team and asked them to meet her at the office first thing Monday morning. Then she spent the weekend going through her files, pulling together every document, every email, every piece of evidence that detailed Lawson Infrastructure's pattern of safety violations. Monday morning found her sitting across from her 3 most senior attorneys in the company's glass-walled conference room. I want to make a deal with the federal prosecutors, she announced without preamble. The lawyers exchanged concerned glances. Margaret, said David Chen, her lead counsel, we've discussed this. The smart play is to fight the charges, make them prove their case. They can prove their case, David, because I'm guilty. Even if that's true, there's no reason to make their job easier. Margaret pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the conference table. This contains documentation of safety violations going back 15 years, including the Hartford Memorial Bridge case. The room went dead silent. Margaret, whispered Sarah Kim, the firm's white-collar defense specialist. What are you doing? I'm telling the truth. Finally. Over the next 2 hours, Margaret walked her legal team through the complete scope of Lawson Infrastructure's misconduct. When she finished, David Chen looked like he'd aged 10 years. This is corporate suicide, he said. You're talking about admitting to crimes that could put you away for life. I know. Then why? Margaret thought about Thomas's quiet dignity, about Emily's unexpected forgiveness, about 23 families who had lost loved ones because she'd chosen profits over people. Because it's right. The negotiations with federal prosecutors took 2 weeks. Margaret's willingness to cooperate and provide evidence against other industry players earned her a reduced sentence, but she would still serve 8 to 10 years in federal prison. The news broke on a Thursday morning. By noon, Lawson Infrastructure stock had lost 60% of its value. By Friday, the board of directors had voted her out as CEO and begun bankruptcy proceedings. Margaret watched it all from her penthouse, feeling strangely peaceful. 25 years of building an empire, and she felt more free watching it crumble than she ever had while running it. Her phone rang constantly, reporters, board members, former business associates. She ignored them all. There was only one call she wanted to make. She found Thomas's number in her phone's call log and pressed dial. Margaret. His voice was surprised but not unfriendly. I saw the news, he said. Are you all right? I'm better than I've been in years. She moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. I wanted to thank you. For what? For showing me that peace is more valuable than power, that integrity matters more than success. Thomas was quiet for a moment. I'm glad you found your way to that conclusion. I'll probably go to prison for 8 years. I know, I'm sorry it had to come to that. Margaret felt tears again, but this time they weren't tears of guilt or fear. They were something else, relief maybe, or gratitude. Thomas, could you tell Emily something for me? Of course. Tell her that her mother would be proud of the woman she's becoming. And tell her that sometimes the hardest thing to do is also the most important thing to do. I will. Margaret hung up and sat in her empty penthouse, watching the sun set over a city that would soon forget her name. But somewhere in the mountains of Vermont, a father and daughter would remember that even the worst mistakes could be redeemed by truth. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the visiting room of a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania. She had traded her designer suits for prison uniforms, her penthouse for a shared cell, her empire for 8 hours a day, working in the prison library. But when she saw Thomas and Emily Reed sitting at one of the visiting tables, she felt richer than she ever had as a CEO. "How are you holding up?" Thomas asked as she sat down across from them. "Good days and bad days," Margaret said honestly. "But I sleep better here than I did in my penthouse." Emily, now 17 and even more poised than Margaret remembered, leaned forward. "Dad told me what you said about Mom being proud. I meant every word." "I've been thinking about what you did," Emily continued, "giving up everything to tell the truth. That took real courage." Margaret shook her head. "Your father's the one with courage. He could have destroyed me that weekend, but he chose mercy instead." "Maybe you both have courage," Emily said, "just different kinds." They spent an hour together talking about Emily's senior year plans, Thomas's new consulting work, and Margaret's prison literacy program. When visiting time ended, Thomas stood to leave, then paused. "Margaret, Sarah, my wife, she always said that people aren't defined by their worst mistakes. They're defined by what they do after they make them." Margaret nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. "You're redefining yourself," Emily added. "That's what matters now." Margaret watched them leave, then returned to her cell. Her cellmate, a woman named Rosa, who was serving time for embezzlement, looked up from the book she was reading. "Good visit?" Rosa asked. "The best," Margaret said. That night, Margaret lay in her narrow bunk and thought about snow falling on a Vermont mountainside, about a man who chose forgiveness over revenge, and about a teenage girl wise beyond her years. She thought about the families of the Hartford Bridge victims who would finally have answers and accountability. Most of all, she thought about truth, how heavy it was to carry alone, and how light it became when shared. Outside her window, snow began to fall. Margaret watched the flakes dance past the security lights and smiled. Somewhere, winter was blanketing a mountain estate where a father and daughter had learned that even the deepest wounds could heal. And somewhere in a federal prison, a former CEO slept peacefully for the first time in 7 years, knowing that she had finally chosen the right side of history. The truth, it turned out, really could set you free. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of redemption and truth. Margaret and Thomas's story reminds us that our worst mistakes don't have to define us, but what we do after making them absolutely will. Sometimes the path to healing requires us to lose everything we thought we wanted in order to find what we actually need. Sometimes forgiveness comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes courage looks like giving a power instead of fighting to keep it. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel for more tales that explore the deeper truths about love, loss, and redemption. Share this story with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to choose truth over comfort, integrity over success. What do you think about Margaret's choice? Was Thomas right to forgive? Could you find the courage to give up everything for the truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read everyone and love hearing your perspectives. Until next time, remember that everyone deserves a second chance at happiness, and sometimes the longest journey is the one that leads us back to who we're meant to be.